Ragnar Ulfing, King of Denmark, was not a craven man. He held strong whenever his vassal lords spoke out against him, and he supported the idea of yearly raids in France and Iberia, even in the face of on-site retaliation. But even he quivered at the sight of Ardri Malkin Macmaliosa Worban when the latter sailed into view from the North Sea, approaching the fishing village of Skurde, accompanied by the largest fleet the Norsemen had ever seen. Christian traders among the populace during this moment noted that the people were mortified. They called what was to come Ragnarok. It had been decades since Malkin set foot on Scandinavian soil, yet all knew his name. Malkin first met with Henry at Traject and discussed the battle plans. Malkin, however, had already begun his attack on Denmark. In exchange for consequence-free passage back to Moorland or Arabia, Malkin gave his Moorish prisoners from Iberia trader clothes and sent them to infiltrate the markets of Denmark's cities. They were to poison any food rations set aside for armies and cut off or delay blacksmith supply lines using their pack animals. Unfortunately, despite their best efforts, these measures proved far too reckless and ended up harming just as many civilians as soldiers. But insofar as sowing chaos within Denmark itself, they were highly effective. The levies of Brage Kjelsen were most affected, with formation plans being upended practically overnight, as vast swathes of his soldiers either fell ill or passed on from the toxins they ingested. Not even himself spared the worst. The Danes interpreted the wave of death as part of whatever curse was to befall them, as the Angel neared his second landing, which indeed most historians agree was Malkin's plan all along. Malkin's landing in Skurde was itself a relatively peaceful affair. The Ardri had chosen to postpone the forceful conversion of these heathens to after he'd pacified their elite, so he adopted a policy of, if they flee, let them live, in regards to the civilian populace. His initial march into Jutland was indeed met with mostly fear and cowering from the commoners and tradesmen, who were given temporary amnesty if they chose to submit to Malkin or his commanders. Not all of the Danes accepted the doom and gloom, however. Many significant militias of Danes, comprised of both men and women, interpreted the signs as a challenge from the gods, a test of their integrity in the face of the world's impending demise. These militias were surprisingly tightly organized, though their lack of funding led to them being under-equipped, meaning they were all but dead when facing either a cavalry charge or an arrow volley in any open field. Knowing this, they often hid inside their home villages or the woods surrounding them, waiting to pounce on any passing Celtic armies using large rocks and home utensils as weapons, not expecting to win per se. Their main goal was to simply send a message to the Celts, and to perhaps weaken them for the actual Danish armies. To the Celts, these militias were known colloquially as banshees or banshee hordes, due to their propensity for silence until attack, whereupon they would begin to screech like ghosts. Malkin's host first encountered a banshee horde in, as the military report claimed, the third village marched through inland. We do not know which village it was, as the Irishmen writing the aforementioned reports did not seem to bother recording any place names, widely believing Denmark would fall quickly and quietly. Malkin also firmly believed this, despite his previous notion that Denmark did not exist. Ragnar's own armies and vassal hosts were, unfortunately, not very quick to cut off Malkin's advance, with the majority of their soldiers being staffed in the vast Danish archipelago, where most of the Viking elite lived, but not where Malkin was marching. Many secondary and tertiary sources from traveling scribes and merchants in the region describe the eventual arrival of a Danish peasant, the size of a mountain, often referred to specifically by that nickname, Fjell. By most accounts, this peasant marched into Ragnar's fortress near Gubenhaven with nothing but leather leggings and a bloodied axe. Upon reaching Ragnar, Fjell threw the axe down at the king's feet and kneeled, reportedly saying, "Defend us of the peninsula, or this axe is for your neck." Ragnar was immediately impressed by the display of confidence and unwavering aggression, demanding Fjell be granted a Drenger gear to help him in leading his peasants' army alongside the command of Ragnar's son, Bragi, named after the late Kjelsen, to destroy the advancing Celts. Most historians today believe this was largely a story passed along in taverns that glossed over the true facts. Fjell was indeed a very large man, but he was not a Danish peasant, but rather an exiled lord of the Halsting clan of Sweden, largely obliterated during Geir Dennis's conquests around 990. Fjell Halsting lived amongst the Jutlanders, in his exile out of fear that the Shetlander elite were either next to be conquered by the Lithuanians or perhaps they'd already submitted to their rule. However, amidst the onslaught of the Celts, he visited Ragnar and called him to arms lest he be branded a coward. Ragnar indeed was reluctant to have any host abandon the Danish archipelago because he felt trapped. Either the Celts take down Jutland and reach the islands, or the Lithuanians take the islands during a hypothetical defense of Jutland. Fjell recognized Ragnar's indecision as simply being unsure how best to proceed, so Fjell stepped up to help combat the Celts, whilst Ragnar would hold out against the encroaching Balts. Fjell most notably seemed to have a way of persuading people to take up arms, even people who held, at best, a tenuous relationship with the Danes. In particular, Fjell knew how to appeal to the Fabulsuletet, woodborn tribe of Hungarians, who had settled the remote woods of Jutland after their great dispersal from the wandering kingdom over a century prior. These were people of fierce martial tradition and discipline, meaning whoever had command of them could potentially have command of Denmark. The first large-scale battle took place in a marsh on the northernmost quarter of Jutland between Malkin's central host, comprised of Emerald Army rookies, versus Fjell and his peasant army with Hungarian bowmen on the flanks. The encounter ended with both armies retreating, as the marsh proved to be far more volatile than it appeared. However, the Hungarian bowmen followed the Celtic army in the shadows, hoping to be able to kill Malkin in his sleep. They were instead captured, and forced to give the Celts the location of their village in the woods before being offered baptism. Half of the bowmen accepted the offer, believing the Celts were destined to win, while the others were promptly hanged for heathenry. This was a common theme throughout Jutland. The Hungarians lived in poverty and fear under the Danes whenever armies marched inland, but the Celts offered them peace and rank if they accepted Christ and submitted their men to fight for them. By the turn of 992, Malkin had turned at least 13 tribes of Hungarians to his cause, out of the estimated 60 located throughout Jutland. This was enough to lure Fjell out of hiding with rumors that a major Celtic commander was captured. Of course, this was false, and Fjell was ambushed and cornered. Rather than accept capture and hanging, he charged his would-be captors and accepted a bloodier end. What remained of his armies thus fled south into old Saxon lands held by King Ademar, a Christian convert, and it is likely they joined his levies to help fight in the war he was having with Pomerania at the time. The conquest of Jutland proved to be fruitful when in 993 Malkin successfully blockaded every port built around Jutland, enabling a seizure of supply lines, which immediately made wintering in the region no trouble for the Celts. In the meantime, Malkin enacted his peaceful occupation of the existing Norsemen, instructing his officers to allow their lives to proceed as before, but only to punish public displays of heathenry, while Celtic priests spread the word of God. The Proxim of Niórua, Henry, commanded his corps of embedded veterans of the Emerald Army and led them to apply pressure to Sjaland and Ragnar. Ragnar chose to hold a defensive stance against this, but his son Bragi organized a unit of young and restless Drengar to build some ships and sail out to sack Henry's fleet, all without Ragnar's knowledge. The move was reckless and stripped a key plot of land of its resources just to forge weapons and build the ships, but Bragi was successful in breaking the Celtic fleet and slaughtering Henry. Henry Wakalida was dead. Some reports even stating Bragi took his head and delivered it to Ragnar. Henry guided the Republic for a respectable 13 years. His death sent a shock to Celtic forces, though the Norse elite were not so enthused, as Henry may have been apprised, but he was not the angel of Christendom. The Viking elite was enthused, however, by the arrival of Sigismund Miklas, a Swede who just finished a 20-year stint as a Varangian in Constantinople. Hearing that Sweden was lost but Denmark could be saved, he elected to bring his reward host to help repel the Celts. There was a complication. Miklas was now a devout Christian, thanks to his time in Constantinople, but Ragnar could hardly afford to refuse his help. Further complicating matters for Ragnar was his tightening of security in towns throughout the archipelago, instilling a sustained fear of refugees from Jutland due to a number of civilian-born attempts on Ragnar's life, which could only be possible thanks to this influx. Malkin was using every avenue available to neuter the Vikings. Ragnar naturally responded to the incessant hostility within his own towns by collecting his most loyal guards and locking himself away in his hall, ordering the stripping of nearby woods to fortify his position. Although this made it difficult to target him for assassination, it also bottlenecked his personal supplies and reportedly damaged his mental state. Sigismund and Bragi continued to heed his orders up until, in 994, he finally instructed them to sack and burn a town full of innocents. The town was in Jutland, and by now hosted a significant Christian population thanks to the Celtic conquest and settlement. According to accounts at the time, Bragi ultimately relented and started a fire, but Sigismund challenged him to a duel on the burning footpaths, as he could not abide the reckless slaughter of innocent Christians. The duel cost Sigismund his axe hand, but Bragi was killed. Sigismund then mounted an effort to evacuate the town and douse the fires, and finally sent for Malkin to parley. Malkin was not happy with Sigismund not negotiating on behalf of Ragnar, but the deal on offer was nonetheless favorable. Sigismund would merge his forces with the Celtic armies to storm Kubenhaven and dethrone Ragnar, installing himself as a Christian king of Denmark. Malkin instead agreed to submit a portion of his army to help Sigismund take the archipelago, while the bulk of the Celtic forces would remain in Jutland to secure the peninsula. The advance into the archipelago in spring 995 was surprisingly quiet. The two armies met sparse resistance at Funen despite Sigismund's warnings otherwise. When scouted, the fort held by Jarl Ingemar Ingemarsson appeared to be deserted. Tolsinga and Longaland had their towns on lockdown, citizens apparently instructed to keep everybody out. A handful of Banshee hordes did strike amidst the push into Lowland, but none appeared to be organized when investigated. Falster was the first island where armies met significant resistance. The forces of Jarl Kjell Dagson stood at the crossing to the Isle of Mun to halt the advancing Celts and Miklas, but a week-long siege routed the token force, and Dagson was found to be not present. Mun was completely deserted. The final island to press was the big one, Sjaland. Advancement ceased when scouts spotted camps of Viking warriors all around the island, equipped with their civilian apparatuses and seers as though ready to impose their own rule. Captured messengers spilled the secret. The Jarls were organizing to dethrone Ragnar amidst his madness and isolation, not to mention his welcoming Sigismund back to Denmark in the first place. The king holed himself up in a freshly constructed fort on the Isle of Amager, surrounded by spiked ditches. Malkin ordered his forces to hold back and let the Jarls tear each other apart, but Sigismund pushed onward to break up the fighting so the realm's cohesion could be preserved. The resulting confrontation came to be known as the Amager Slaughter. Several Jarls refused to parley with Sigismund, but those who joined him besieged the king's fortress, while those resistant were flanked and picked off by Malkin and Erkan, the new proxim of Niórua. In the end, a hole was bored into the fortress walls and Sigismund rushed in to seize Ragnar, who was taken prisoner. What followed was a standoff only legends could immortalize. Malkin approached the victorious Sigismund and demanded he stand down and accept vassalage under Erkan. But Sigismund still had a huge number of supporters who stood firm. Malkin tried appealing to religion, but Sigismund argued that he could bring Christ to his realm in his own way, rather than the Celts who favored forceful occupation. Ultimately, in 996 it was settled that Jutland would be ceded to Niórua, while the archipelago would remain independent under Sigismund. However, Sigismund was poisoned at his coronation a week later, with Norse extremists claiming the deed and sacking numerous towns. Yet Malkin would not remain to mop up the mess. He was then approached by a papal legate, who informed him of plans to seize the Holy Land to protect the city of Jerusalem, which had been occupied and fortified by the Eastern Roman Empire decades earlier in 928. The Musayyid Caliphate was hauling in nomadic Bactrian hordes to invade and retake the city. Malkin's service in the infamous Second Crusade was significant enough that the Pope of the time outwardly declared he be given a new title, Seraphim Magnus, meaning Great Angel, which with time morphed into the nickname Serpimax. Although his time in the Near East is not relevant to the story of Niórua, his absence certainly shaped the atmosphere of the area for the next decade. With the death of Sigismund, a relatively minor jarl named Kolbrun seized Gibbonhaven and cowed the Viking armies to follow him. In Jutland, Dane rebels were emboldened with the knowledge that Serpimax was several months away, and often led gangs of bandits into the forests of Jutland to disrupt everyday life of the area. Erkan grew frustrated with the onslaught of complications, as he was still wrestling with tenuous politics in Norway, let alone his new occupied peninsula. All the same, in 1001 he mounted an offensive into the interior of Jutland, hoping to root out the troublesome elements within his domain, with the promise from Malkin that reinforcements fresh out of fighting in Syria were incoming. Malkin's task force was able to wipe out 4 conspiracies against Celtic occupation over the next few years. But in early 1003, a super-confederation of surviving bandits rose, led by a secretive cabal of influential Danes, known for dressing in black clothing and hoods to hide their identity. These folks called themselves the Kraka, meaning raven. The Kraka most notably began to permeate even the armies of the Celts, via young generations of displaced Norsemen who were used to Irish occupation. They even tried to infiltrate Norway, but the Celtic presence there was simply too strong, so they focused on Denmark. When attending a summit with the Kraka to hammer out a peace treaty, Erkan was grabbed and held down by his own personal guard, revealed to be sympathizers, while the Kraka each took turns stabbing him. He died shortly after sustaining the 4th wound. This sent shockwaves throughout the establishment of Niórua. Councillors were now refusing to accept nomination to be proxim out of fear, but no proxim meant the administrative process was prone to deadlock. Ultimately, it was suggested by a young man named Kukuren Wakalida, a grandson of the proxim Enri, and current table representative of the Wakalida, that an elite corps of soldiers needs to be established who can be trusted to protect the proxim at all costs while being politically neutral. Veterans of the Emerald Army, as well as Christian Norsemen and Hungarians, were gathered and employed for this purpose, establishing the Komtsiriaid der Sach, or Guardians of the End Seat, who would be become the protectors of whomever should sit as Proxim. In due course, this group will arrange itself as a faction with dubious influence in Niórwish politics, but for the time their mission was genuine. For masterminding this corps, Cuchulainn was promptly elected Proxim and led a campaign to destroy the Kraka, which ended with what seemed to be a complete success. Their leader, a seer named Varg, was captured and hanged. Then in 1005, Gyrdanis the Brilliant, the man who conquered the Baltic Sea and built a religious institution through sheer force of will, collapsed in his throne room in Trakai and was pronounced dead later that evening. He had been poisoned, and his brother-in-law Kazimieras was the prime suspect after he then seized the throne. Gyrdanis' eldest son Butvidas then raised an army to fight the usurper, while his younger son Kodere was left in charge of the domain his father tasked him with suppressing, Sweden. Kodere is nicknamed in both Vaida and Christian sources as the Sword of Perkunas, Perkunas being the central deity of Romuva, much akin to Odin for the Danes, or Zeus for the ancient Greeks. Naturally, he gained that nickname through a fearsome reputation for violently handling the Norsemen in Sweden, which was still a majority of the population despite the Finnic and Baltic takeovers of the prior century. Entire villages would be lined up and forced to embrace Romuva en masse, or face wholesale immolation. This strategy was not good for maintaining the region's economy, but it certainly struck fear into the hearts of the Norse and encouraged mass conversion. For the Norse, it was often a toss-up whether the Celts or the Balts were a bigger threat. The point of this tangent is to highlight that Kodere celebrated his accession to the throne of Sweden with extreme fervor, organizing his loyal corps into an army of death to lure and trap Viking militias throughout Sweden before giving them the same ultimatum given to villages. However, the Vikings wised up the tactics and began to flee, choosing instead to regroup in Denmark. Therefore, the hollowed Kraka suddenly found themselves with access to an army of highly trained Drengar. Even better, somehow they came upon none other than Ragnar Ulfing, the disgraced king, disheveled and begging for food on the streets of Viphelm in Falster. He was apparently freed from captivity by pure chance, bandits attacking the road he was being transported on and killing the Celtic guards who held him, then leaving before even checking if he was dead. Despite his disgrace, the Kraka and newly arrived Swedish refugees knew his name, and in a time of crisis such as this, that gave them more comfort than anything. In early 1006, Ragnar and the leading Swedish jarl named Hjörvar Hjeldra marched into Amag and deposed Kolbrun purely by winning over the soldiers stationed there and convincing them to hand over the pretender, who was promptly blood-eagled. Ragnar then organized a campaign to cut through Jutland in a manner not unlike how Malkin marched in 990, and timed the campaign to begin in the fall of 1006. Just as the snows began to fall, the Norse army was spotted by watchmen stationed at the crossing town of Korgrain, who immediately dispatched messages to alert all of Niórwa. However, mobilizing the defense against the large army proved difficult, and eventually the Celts were pushed back until they were defending coastal towns in Norway from naval raids. Something needed to be done, but Niórwa needed help. In 1007, Cuchulainn set sail for Dublin to press Malkin into a final push to take Denmark. All of it, both Jutland and the archipelago. Malkin by this point was pushing 70, and exhibited symptoms which prevented him from being as active and excitable as he was in his youth. Historians generally agree that by this time he was likely suffering from some neurodegenerative condition, as he lost control of his legs and his arms, to quote a source, had very little will within them. Although he retained his acuity and wit, his diminished presence took a toll on him, and at this point he seemed to have grown tired of fooling around with Denmark. He secretly informed his tanist, Murikan, that he did not truly plan to mount any further campaigns in Scandinavia, apparently having concluded that the region was never worth all this effort. Through the usual channels of court gossip, this was slipped to Cuchulainn, who angrily stormed off to ride for Loch Raman and hire mercenaries through them to supplement his numbers. But en route to the Republic City, he received word that Malkin, Serpimax, the greatest man of the whole generation, finally passed away peacefully. Suddenly became more prudent to ride back to Dublin and beg the new Ardri for direct Empire support. The court of Dublin was in tenuous order following the demise of Serpimax. Although the accession of Wyricon, a distant cousin of Malkin, was quick and fully in accordance with tanistry laws, there were many in the court who doubted the abilities of the man, largely fueled by recent minor blunders he had in small admin affairs, all in the wake of the frankly impossible act to follow that was Serpimax. Chief among his detractors was Rextaber Magaggen, one of his second cousins. Nonetheless, Murdercon showed strong conviction and proved to be competent with finances, as shown with his agreement to make a final push into Denmark by entrusting low-rung, low-wage clan retinues to Cuchulainn, with Murdercon then promising he would eventually come to Denmark himself alongside significant reinforcements. The initial press into Jutland to counter the Norse campaign there kicked off in spring of 1008, and proved to be a roaring success, as it became clear that Ragnar and the Kraka really spread themselves thin by tearing through the peninsula in the last campaign, and Christianity reigned strong in the region now. Resistance to the Norse occupation was fierce, and Cuchulainn came in time to fight off the pagans once and for all. They were pushed back into the archipelago, where as expected they shacked up in fortresses across the islands to force the Celts to divide their armies, but Cuchulainn held back and waited for Muirchán to arrive. But when he did arrive in the summer of 1008, disaster struck. Reports of what happened exactly are scarce and scattered, so the details are lost to time. But the upshot is that Muirchán tried to attack the fortress at Armagh by sea, but was flanked by a huge fleet of longboats who promptly set the Celtic fleet ablaze. According to Muirchán himself, he survived by clinging to a piece of broken wood where the waves had him turn up somewhere in Pomerania, and he was forced to wander for months until he found somebody in early 1009 who could speak Irish so he could relay a message and receive help. He was received in a royal vessel around Vorgas and taken home to Dublin, where he learned he'd been replaced by Rectabra, who formally deposed Muirchán for his blunder and assigned him as King of Alba. Rectabra was less receptive to the push to quell Denmark for good. The era was tense, with England, still independent of the empire though ruled by a distant Orban cousin, making noises about Boer enforcement, and Francia licking its lips while looking at Breton lands. The core of the Celtic army was to be kept in the core of the empire to keep its neighbours at bay. Niórua was valued to a degree, but it was simply not as immediately urgent to Dublin. All Cuchulainn could do was wait and watch and push the Vikings back. As the Celtic armies withdrew, Ragnar pushed for another campaign to cut through Jutland, but his efforts were quickly undercut in 1010 by the interception of correspondence. Kodere was reaching out to Cuchulainn for a parley. The Baltic Swede promised that he could destroy the archipelago if the Celts allowed him to keep it, while promising Jutland to the Celts. However, the deal never made itself known to Cuchulainn, as Ragnar had it burnt before ordering the heads of Baltic prisoners be sent back to Kodere. But as fate would have it, the advisor Ragnar tasked with this mission was a spy for Cuchulainn, and it was revealed that the letter was a fake, meant to goad Ragnar into provoking Kodere. Cuchulainn had hoped to let the pagans kill each other before he'd come in with fresh warriors to mop up the inevitable mess. It was a huge risk, as nobody between the Celts and Danes really understood what Kodere had at his disposal. However, the situation was diffused when Ragnar simply found the heads of fellow Danes, many of whom were Jarls, sent to him, ostensibly from Kodere, with the message, "With this we are even. Stay your hand now, or I shall take it as well." The sight of countless Jarls' heads obliterated morale within the Danish army, as soldiers began defecting or fleeing. On a wet spring day in 1011, the Celtic fortress near the strait between Funen and Jutland was suddenly put on high alert when a hooded man approached. The man was revealed to be Ragnar, turning himself over to Cuchulainn and requesting a Christian baptism. However, to the shock of many, Cuchulainn refused to allow him this concession and ordered Ragnar beheaded. Ragnar left behind a crumbling court to be picked up by Hjörvar Hjeldra. Hjeldra was not especially popular with the people, being a foreigner from Sweden, who generally kept to himself and did not put his own name out there. But none of the other remaining Jarls wanted to step up and take Ragnar's place, and only Hjeldra had the late king's confidence. They needed someone to organize the resistance against the inevitable Celtic incursion into the lands, and if they did nothing, their realm had no chance. In late 1011, the Krukka and the Jarls merged their forces in Armagh under Hjeldra and set up crude defenses across the islands, slowing the Celts down intermittently. However, there was a critical flaw in this defensive campaign. Slaves in his court were largely Christian, and passed info they heard down to tradesmen, who were also men of God, and they passed it along to fishermen, who would convene with Cuchulainn. This was an information stream that had been active for months and did not take long to keep up to date. Every single detail of the archipelago defense was leaked to Cuchulainn, who took the opportunity to call for imperial support from Dublin before employing his own plan. Knowing where the least Viking eyes would look, while also taking advantage of the foggy weather, Cuchulainn maneuvered a large fleet of fishing boats carrying Celtic soldiers around the islands, under fog cover to land at the vulnerable spot. The plan was not without complication. Once the fog lifted and hundreds of boats were found by Norse scouts, a storm of arrow volleys proceeded between the two armies. But by this point, Cuchulainn and his central corps were on Armagh, and sneaking into the Viking fortress with help from the slaves who passed the information along. The fortress had a skeleton crew, as most of Hjeldra's army were defending new forts, or joining in the ongoing massacre at the beach near Hurjerup. Cuchulainn and his comsire found Hjeldra in his bedchambers, praying in Latin. This alone stayed Cuchulainn's hand. Seeing which way the wind was blowing, Hjeldra had, at least outwardly, embraced Christianity in a desperate effort to calm down the Celts, originally planning to parley with Cuchulainn and reveal the banner then. He then negotiated a treaty much to Cuchulainn's liking. Allow Hjeldra to remain king of Denmark, and upon his death, the crown will pass to Niórua. Cuchulainn agreed, and then helped Hjeldra round up the Jarls to give the Malkaid's classic ultimatum: convert or die. News passed around quickly, such that after 2 jarls were converted, the rest fled with the Krukka to convene on the far end of the Sjælland and amass for a last stand. But this army was run down with ease by the arriving Emerald Army, as led by Ardri Rektabra. To ensure Hjaldra's loyalty to his promises, his granddaughter was taken as a hostage to Dublin. The next few years were peaceful for Niórua. Viking raids slowed to a near halt. Cuchulainn provided help to repair the damages in Denmark. Things ticked along. Then Hjaldr finally passed away in late 1017. Cuchulainn came down to Sjælland and established his title there, then appointed some Celtic merchant lords to move in and seize the lands to build up the new administration. Denmark was finally won.